Welcome everyone and good afternoon to the third and final webinar of a three-part webinar series on establishing successful pollinator habitat in solar projects. My name is Charles Gould and I am an extension educator with Michigan State University. I am the moderator for today's session, today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted as soon as closed captioning is completed. At the completion of this webinar, there will be a survey that's going to pop up on your screen. And I would respectfully ask you, if you would, to fill it out. It should only take you a minute or two to do so. It's our way of measuring impact, and it's really critical to the work that we do here in Extension. I'd like to briefly explain the purpose for these webinars. In Michigan, we have what is called the Farmland and Open Space Preservation Program, which is more commonly referred to as PA 116. This program is designed to preserve farmland and open spaces and offers tax relief to farmers who voluntarily participate in this program. It is administered by the Michigan Department of Agriculture. PA 116 was amended to include solar projects with the stipulation that, and I quote, the owner agrees to plant a cover crop, including pollinator habitat, under the solar panels to reduce erosion and to maintain soil fertility, close quote. Farmers who sign a solar lease agreement cannot claim the tax credits during the time the land is being used to produce solar power. Since PA 116 was amended, there have been many questions as to what it means to establish a pollinator habitat in a solar project in Michigan. The September 1st webinar on solar pollinator habitat establishment, last Tuesday's solar pollinator virtual field day, and today's webinar on maintaining a pollinator habitat in a solar project are efforts to provide clear answers to these questions. Next slide. Our content expert today is Ryan Kozaitek. Ryan is a stewardship field director for the Kalamazoo Nature Center and has been practicing in the field of habitat restoration since 2008. He is trained as a wildlife firefighter and serves on the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council's steering committee. Ryan enjoys spending time out of doors with his family. It is there that his two daughters remind him that there is still plenty to learn about things we know. Today, Ryan will be addressing the topic of once a pollinator habitat has been established, how should it be maintained so it continues to function as a pollinator habitat. We look forward to learning from you today, Ryan, and the time is now yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be with you all virtually, as we are with most people these days. Excited to be here to talk about this topic. As was mentioned, I'm the stewardship field director for the Kalamazoo Nature Center. I've been there since 2008. Actually, my first few years with the Nature Center were spent on our seasonal restoration crew. And that's kind of where a lot of my, I guess, chops for restoration and land management were formed. I did not expect that at that time that I'd be walking around with a field guide for wildflowers in my back pocket, but that has definitely been something that's been with me since. So there's kind of a blurred line between profession and where my hobbies tend to lie. So we can get started for sharing my screen. Let's see here, I'm missing the button for that. There we go. And we are ready. Again, a little bit of my background. I also was a former SISMA coordinator for the Barry, Calhoun, and Kalamazoo Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. Some of the topic today will be on invasive species, so that'll be another resource. There's a SISMA for every predetermined region out in the state of Michigan. With the Kalamazoo Nature Center, we were founded in 1960, and one of our founding principles was conservation biology. And over the years, we've gotten our hands more so in the dirt to take part in that stewardship aspect of the conservation work. Our Ecological Services program functions within our Conservation Stewardship Department. And within that, we provide invasive species management for anywhere from large scale work, working with the Michigan Army National Guard in Battle Creek and up at Camp Grayling. But we also do private land restoration type work too. So there's no project too small for that area too. Our natural shoreline installation, we do work with that as well. Done wetland mitigation. We've done some biocontrol for purple loosestrife raising the Galaricella beetles. For that, this year was actually a year that we have a gap in that because of all the issues people know about. We do also do prescribed fire consultation. In the past, we've been able to do kind of small scale burns here and there, but our primary operational scope for our prescribed fire right now is with ourselves and the lands that we manage and with the Michigan Army National Guard. But we're also there to help kind of make that connection too, as it becomes a much more needed tool throughout the region. Ecological surveys and inventories is stuff that we also do, as well as also partnering with corporations for wildlife habitat certifications. For today, just a brief summary. It's going to be kind of a general overview for what could be expected as you go through and need to maintain the habitat that's created. And so we'll look at planning for management, some of the management methods, phases of management, alterations and enhancement, solar array considerations, and then of course, monitoring will be an important aspect of that. As we go through, it was tough to really just start where it seemed to be the most important. So please just consider that all these stages have some level of greater importance at any point in the phases of these. So just a little bit of background, some of the, if you've participated in some of the earlier webinars around this topic, you may have come across some of these aspects of the pollinator habitat before, but they're also very good to review in the maintenance stage too. And also if those who are maintaining those spaces, it's good for them to have that background information too, because we're through the process of establishing that pollinator habitat all the way until we have something that's pretty mature and functioning. We're going to be looking for clues along the way to help guide our management. And so we'll need some tools and some historical understanding of those. So here's a classic image looking at the plant root systems of prairie plants. If you look at the left side of that, there's, I think it's like Kentucky bluegrass, and showing that very shallow root system. This has been in the past shown to demonstrate the drought resistance for these plants. However, more recently, they're showing that the plant is actually doing their water uptake from about the top 10 to 30 inches of soil, no more than that 30 inches. So these deep root systems, there's still a lot more to learn about them. They definitely are good at sequestering carbon over changes in individuals as they pass along. But there might be some other portions of that plant or other functions of that plant that help it to survive drought. Just as recently some areas have been seeing that the plants will actually senesce early and go dormant earlier in the year to save some of those resources. As we're looking at habitat management and management for these pollinator spaces, we're really kind of talking about a system that is used to disturbance, is used to something coming through and kind of resetting the successional stages. I try to find a better image. The one on the left there with the fire, that's kind of, for me, working on Michigan Prescribed Fire Council, that's not the types of fires we typically see in southern Michigan. But anyway, Going through, this is secondary succession happening when you still have some kind of soil base after disturbance. And the area that we're kind of functioning within for these pollinator habitats are this kind of earlier secondary successional stage when you start getting some of the earlier plants coming on. So if we look at the disturbance that was created to site prep our pollinator habitat, we're looking at that beginning 0 to 2 years. And then when the later stages of the perennials and grasses that we're going to be working with, that's at 3 to 4 years. And you can see if we get any further into that, we start to get things like shrubs and trees and things growing up in those areas. So a lot of the management strategies for this are going to be some level of disturbance to kind of take us back and reset the structural succession of that system. So planning for management, there's, these things, again, we're going into site planning or planning for where these pollinator habitats are going to occur. But again, this is information that's good to, as you go along the growth cycle for that pollinator habitat, some of the background information that's gonna be helpful to discovering why certain plants might be coming up at some times, or why we need to be more patient as we wait for those habitats to mature. So looking at our natural history, some of the site specifics of the project site, and kind of looking at what are the common challenges and anticipating what mitigation steps we might have to take to prevent some of the unexpected. So for the natural history of some of these different habitats, the Michigan Natural Features Inventory is a site that I use quite commonly. A lot of the pollinator habitat types of the suite of species that go into those pollinator mixes come from some of these habitat types. And so you can get a good view through some of these abstracts, community abstracts for those habitats to look at, where it would have occurred normally, what the soil types were, the disturbance regimes that go through some of those habitats as well. Site specifics, site history is good. We're lucky to have had a farmer that was farming the land that the Nature Center is now on since he was 14 years old. And so when we go through some of our projects, we pull Mick in to inform us on some of the, whether it be grazing or level of agriculture in certain areas that might have been covered up by years of succession before we go into a project. But we're also looking into things like what was the circa 1800 vegetation for our area. And as you can see, that red star up in here, that's us within Kalamazoo County. And if you look at the key, we are planting all of our prairie habitats in what was historically beech sugar maple forest. And so by knowing that, we can anticipate some of the management challenges working in soil that is a little more loamy, has a little more clay content than what the prairies would have been when we did plant them. However, because of the lack of prairie ecosystems and habitats, it was still a habitat type that we wanted to recreate in what was historically beech maple forests. Some of those common challenges that we want to look forward to, of course, there is always the mechanical challenges and some of the equipment when getting from site to site. But these challenges, I try to look at them as opportunities for collaboration and knowledge gaining. So some of these opportunities for collaboration can be with competing objectives. These plantings are inherently interdisciplinary, and so they pull in a lot of folks from a lot of different areas that may not be part of their expertise, but will be important in some kind of partnership going forward to make these plantings successful, and also making some new connections along the way. Again, with some of these plantings that we're talking about in in light of solar panels or solar array installations. We do have a limited space, so that also places some challenges on the management itself, as we'll see a little bit later. Ground nesting birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects, all of these organisms that we want these plantings to be kind of functioning microhabitats. You will have quite a few of those that'll move in there, and then so we want to be managing in a way that's not necessarily detrimental to a lot of the organisms that are depending on these systems, and which can be, you know, with it being disturbance dependent, you can imagine some of the challenges that come up with that. So it's good to have eyes on the ground and know what's kind of occupying that space. And we'll definitely talk about monitoring as we go along here too. And then one of the other challenges that is pretty common, I wanted to highlight a little bit more, are invasive species. And the biggest thing for invasive species, during that site prep phase, you may have identified some of them ahead of time, but they might be something that will be present in the seed bank and not necessarily apparent until we've created that initial disturbance when prepping our site for that planting. Invasive species can be plants, pests, or pathogens. And so getting an idea of what is local and what's regionally abundant, regionally a concern, it might be a species that is not yet in the area, but on its way. Also looking at proximal sources. So these are adjacent areas where you may be able to see whether it's garlic mustard or tree of heaven, even black locust, some of those growing up in adjacent areas that you know you already have a seed source for, and you can anticipate that coming in as that early successional stage is occurring. So invasive species, non-native, and it's likely to cause some kind of economic, environmental, or harm to human health. There's an invasive species stool. That's a good way to kind of look at how invasive species are use that disturbance to their advantage, that being that favorable environment. So that's an area that they're able to grow in. Typically with some of those invasive species, they're really good at showing up early, and so they will mature sooner and therefore even get their vegetative growth above ground, and even shading out some of the plants that you have worked on putting in there can be, with the light availability competition, be a big concern for that. Lack of controls being that some of those invasive species are non-native, but non-native doesn't necessarily mean invasive as well. There are some plants that have been, I guess, termed to be naturalized in those areas, something like Queen Anne's lace, where it may be a non-native plant, but not necessarily be invasive in the sense that it will, over time, be a large competitor in that system. And rapid reproduction. Their invasive species are typically really good at putting out an abundance of next generation genetic material. So for the invasive species curve, this is a good way at looking why it's important to identify these things early on and address them early on as well. So when we see establishment of new populations, on the y-axis there, you can see the total area infested, and on the right side, you can see how costs go up over time. And so that x-axis showing us through time, as a population gets established, it certainly becomes less likely that the eradication is going to take place and you get into more of a containment. Now for these sites, you can think of them as, I guess, locally eradicated or site eradicated. Some of those invasive species might be common over the landscape. It's something you can certainly work on removing for competition for those native pollinators. One that's got a hot button for is the Japanese knotweed. Some of you all may be or may not be familiar with this one. This one is something to definitely pay attention to. It's very difficult to get rid of once it is established. It responds very well to disturbance. So something like fire, any kind of disturbance to the soil, the rhizomes of the root system that they can chop up about to the size of a pinky nail and still form a new plant. And those plants can stay dormant for 20 years before losing their viability in some form. Japanese knotweed, knowing how to identify it early and treat it early is something you're going to, one of those invasive species that you want to look at. Now, depending on your region, this is the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network. So a lot of that information on what of those species will be of concern regionally can be found through this site. This is where a lot of the cooperative invasive species management areas communicate through. So you can get connected with one of those regional groups to give you a heads up on some of those. So we do, have a concern with invasive species, but we don't have to necessarily be the expert on them. And as we go through this presentation too, that'll be kind of a theme that we'll show is there are a lot of resources out there to help assist you all with something that might seem challenging initially. In this, on this website, there are these best control practices. So once you've identified one of those species, we can click on the species we've identified, and they've got Michigan DNR and has put through, and Michigan Natural Features Inventory put together these abstracts on specific plants. And also at the end of them too, we'll give you types of treatment that is beneficial and the timing of those treatment too. So not every plant will respond to management the same way. And it's good to know how those plants will before we go ahead and address those. Some of the methods for management that we're going to go through today. We're going to highlight the prescribed fire and mechanical just for the sake of time, because we could even get further into the chemical and grazing. But again, those management methods that you see here, their common theme again is some type of disturbance. Prescribed fire for these systems is a natural disturbance, but because of some of the issues revolving around smoke management and being in some urban locations, prescribed fire may not be the tool that would be able to be used. There's certainly a lot of reasons why to use the trained professional to do that. And then mechanical, we'll get into the details of that too. I popped up here this conservation action planning. A lot of what we're doing here, and the reason why the monitoring is going to be so important that we'll talk about later, is because each stage of management kind of has this like circular set of stages that you are being adaptive in your approach. As you develop the strategies and measures, then we'll implement some of what those strategies are based on trusted information, monitor those results, and then we'll make those adjustments. And depending on the site, some things may have worked at other locations, but some reason is you're not getting the results that you would expected. So how are we going to turn around and change our strategies to be more effective for that? But really it's these methods too are, they're integrated as well. So we're not expecting that one tool or one method is alone is going to do that. There might have to be a suite of tools that are being used in order to get the best results. So for our phases of management, we've got, we're expecting right now from the other presentations that we have everything planted. And now it's time to just let everything come up naturally, and we can kind of set it and forget it, which is a joke. The being able to set it and forget it, kind of walk away from that planting time is kind of setting yourself up for not being as successful as you could be. So there's kind of two different phases. We'll look at that establishment phase. There are different management methods and tools during that term, which is more short term, and then the maintenance phase of those habitats once we have things established a little bit better, and all of a sudden we're starting to see some of that above ground biomass or plant mass being apparent. So for this establishment phase, as critical as the site preparation phase for that too. So for prepping those sites, you can really set yourself up for success by being diligent with the tasks that need to happen, making sure that you're reducing a lot of those competitive species before you're planting new ones. So once we have the species planted over the next 2 to 3 years, depending on how that area has responded, a lot of mowing in some of those areas. And what that mowing does, it's going to, for anything that's remaining in the seed bank yet, after those site preparation tasks, as they go to produce their seed, you're basically preventing them from introducing more seeds into that seed bank and giving the native plants that you have planted time to essentially establish the root systems. When different types of pollinator habitats are initially planted, those individual plants spend a lot of their initial time on root growth. And so they have a little bit of green vegetation on top to help out with that, but they're really creating a lot of their biomass below ground before they are expressing themselves above ground. So during that time, it can take up to 2 to 3 years. A lot of those plants need some kind of either scarification with the seeds, so rubbing against bits of sand and soil, or it needs cold stratification, which means periods of freezing in order to have that seed germinate. So while we're waiting for those natural things to occur, this is really just decreasing that genetic competition from the species that are currently in that soil bank. So nature does need nurture, and during this time, it's still important to monitor and evaluate, being aware for again some of those EDRR is early detection, rapid response, and it's a term that's borrowed for invasive species management to essentially being vigilant in those areas so that you can respond to them soon, and you might be able to even do so during this kind of establishment phase for those habitats, and which can require some small chemical spot treatments. Some of them might even be able to be pulled depending on the type of resources that you have. And then there's this idea too, during this phase, that not all weeds are invasives. They might be indicators. They could be indicators of soil health. So if they're doing well, it might be an indicator that, so we've planted some areas that have been in like a fallow field or old field, and that responds a lot differently than something that had been under the plow, disturbing the soil microbes over time. And so again, those weeds, they might be indicators of soil compaction. And so that instead of being a weed, you can see them as doing a job essentially to kind of create a little more arid soils. But so, as you monitor, have somebody who knows what they're looking at, but being able to kind of look at those as how those might be indicating whether or not you're going to be seeing good results at the end of those 2 to 3 years. So once we've gone through, we've been diligent about our mowing. Oh, just as a side note too, for that mowing, that 8-inch mowing deck height is pretty important. Any lower than that, it might be detrimental to some of the native plants that are in there. So that's one thing that to pay attention to as you mow. And for that, some mowers may not be the right tool for the job. So making sure that you've got the right tool for that as well, something that can be raised up to an adequate height. So once we've gotten through that establishment phase, now we're moving into a phase of maintenance. And I look at this as, because we're working with a habitat type that requires disturbance, it means that we have to be present for when that disturbance is determined to happen. And so that's kind of when that maintenance phase takes place, as we're doing things that are more regular and expected over time, but are less labor intensive than that initial, can be less intensive than that initial establishment phase. I mentioned earlier as one of the potential challenges being small areas that we're working within. It's because typically, because in those organisms that might be detrimental, or it might be detrimental having a disturbance, we operate on this general rule that 70% of the habitat of the planting is left alone, and leaving some kind of refuge for wildlife, for insects, for that. So some insects don't do well with fire, and so that's one way to mitigate for that, is by not burning all spaces and letting some areas maintain populations of those insects. Again, for this maintenance phase, we might get into things like grazing, managing invasive species and habitats and landscapes with goats and sheep has been kind of a hot topic over recent years, and is something that we've utilized a couple times with the Nature Center, but that is something that deserves its own presentation, I think. With chemicals too, using herbicides, that's another very deep topic, and so we won't necessarily get into different types of chemicals and when they're appropriate for use. A lot of those can be discovered through Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development for information on that, or wherever your local regulatory agency might be located. So for today in this maintenance phase, we'll be talking about use of prescribed fire and some mechanical options. So for prescribed fire, the thing that we do with the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council, of course, is we promote the safe use of fire as a management tool. Safe use is definitely key to that. Whether or not you can use fire in the area is really determined based on the overseeing agency, the permitting agency for that fire. For us in Kalamazoo, or for the Kalamazoo Nature Center, we have our township fire department that we work with to do that, but it might be some other municipality, or in certain areas you could be working with state agencies to get those fires as a tool that can be used. So prescribed fire, it is a natural tool. These systems have adapted over thousands of years of some kind of level of fire disturbance, and humans using fire has been more and more we're finding out that humans were the larger cause of those fire for many different reasons, whether it be for defense or for mass harvesting of bison, or it could be for, I don't know, it could be a lot of reasons why humans would have used prescribed fire in the past. But at that point, to say that as long as humans have been in fire available systems, it's been a cooperative effort between the humans and that tool. Now, fire effects, the effects that you get from the fire, some might consider them unmatched, although we'll look at some substitutions for fire when fire is not available. But initially, looking at its structural disturbance for setting back that level, or that successional stage. We also have carbon inputs, so readily available carbon that is at the surface and then can penetrate through those soil layers to be available not only for the plants, but also helping by keeping some of those soils more moisture rich. And as I mentioned earlier, we saw those deep root systems. The fire is able to, well, weed out some of the species that you may not be wanting there as you're trying to establish these pollinator habitats. Those species being adapted to that, it'll help you in that management towards selecting for those native plants. With our fire, we're looking at having trained and experienced crews. There are contractors that go out there. And in certain cases too, a local fire department might help and get involved, using it as a training opportunity or even a partnership opportunity within the community to be able to help with that. And there are other concerns that go on with fire as well. One thing we talk about being the wildland urban interface. So it might not be the fire itself that is a concern, but it could be the smoke that the fire produces if you're working in proximity to receptors or to individuals that might be sensitive to smoke and particulate matter in the atmosphere. And of course, burn planning for these is another presentation all in itself. We do plenty of trainings for that within the wildland fire community. So to use fire alone is something that is to kind of plan ahead if it seems like it's going to be a viable option, to start speaking with that permitting agency around you and start working with that. Also, the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council is available to help folks work through what will be needed to get fire on the ground and safely in that area. I'm sure there can be plenty of questions about prescribed fire later on. So for mechanical, I talked about some of the things being substitute for that, that fire. And a lot of these substitutes are going to be above ground structural changes to those pollinator habitats. So more mowing again. So after a few years, these that prescribed fire, if remember the secondary successional slide, that prescribed fire is typically used about every 3 to 5 years, depending on the habitat type. And we pay attention to what the historical return interval has been for a fire disturbance. But it's typically 3 to 5 years. And so when we're moving into this maintenance phase too, rather than doing some of these activities on multiple times throughout a year, this might be one thing that's happening after 3 years or so. We've done burns in some areas too, as soon as 1 to 2 years too, depending on the needs of that habitat. But I guess that's the general expectation is 3 to 5 years to come do some level of disturbance for that. So for mechanical, whether it's being mowing, sometimes we've gone through with hand crews to treat some of the shrubs and stuff that may have come up that might not be, might be above the size that a mower needs to handle. But also a light disking. There are guides out there for what that means, but again, it's disturbing the very top layer of the soil to help with that setting back succession and maintaining that kind of open pollinator habitat with that level of disturbance. Some of the considerations going on now that we're moving through this kind of maintenance level phase, there might be some things that be added, amendments to the soils. We could find that through our monitoring that over that 3 to 5 years since planting, we're not quite seeing all of the species that we planted in there, which we may, for different environmental reasons or even reasons of soil issues, we may need to do some interseeding. So this is basically just planting more seeds into the area that we've already had planted to up our species diversity. Biochar is another way of thinking of amending our soils and our habitat. There are some invasive species like spotted knotweed that have a allopathic chemical that can go in the soil and prevent some plants from growing based on the relationship with the microorganisms in the soil. And so what biochar can do in one way is kind of absorb some of those toxins. It's good at having better tilth, or I guess a little more fluff to the soil for better plant root growth. It increasing your moisture in your soil. Biochar is something that regenerative agriculture has been using for a little while now, and it's basically material that's not quite combusted, but brought down to that charcoal state and chopped up and spread like you would a fertilizer into the planting area. Another way too, to kind of these mid-management alteration, maybe planting plugs of plants in high visibility areas. So if it's been that 3 to 5 years and we're not quite seeing some of the that species diversity, you can get native plant plugs from different sources to be able to have a quicker result by starting with a plant that is already germinated and has a decent root system to go. Some habitat enhancements for our areas too, to support some of the wildlife. And in those areas, we're really looking at, if within this planning, we want it to be a successful and functioning pollinator habitat, that means we have to have food, cover, and water for those organisms as well. And it could be more than just the insects that we're interested in. So whether we're doing nest boxes for birds, bee hotels, this example here, we worked with an Eagle Scout to create bee hotels for us too. Ground nesting habitat, there are many pollinators that use either the soil or they might even use down logs and brush for their habitat as well. But having kind of multiple layers of those food and cover availability for those insects is also very advantageous. And those will also need some level of maintenance for it, but are a good way to enhance our pollinator habitats. Looking at some of the considerations for solar arrays, specifically interdepartmental communication. That was one that's been big. So this is actually a picture of our solar array, our first solar array that went in at the Kalamazoo Nature Center. If we can look at in between each one of the panels, you'll see like a newly mowed spot. Well, we actually had strips of habitat in between each one of those panels before we learned from our solar provider that they thought that the plant material was too tall and was affecting the energy output. And so if we wanted to continue working with them with the benefits that we're receiving, we had to work at removing some of that vegetation in between the panels. And so that's, that's part of the planning as well. What is good for the layout for the solar panels may not be good for having kind of some pollinator habitat within and throughout some of that area too. Some of these mowings happened without working with our conservation department directly. It needed to be done, but there was just a little communication for that. I mentioned earlier, these things are very much interdisciplinary, and so identifying and working through our communication network, either within our organization or with our neighbors, is important. If prescribed fire is something that you'd like to do and is available to do, making sure that we plan these areas with adequate burn breaks. For some of our plantings, we've done a low mow fescue, so that our maintenance is still relatively low for that. But when it comes time to do our fire, those are areas that are resistant to fire and can help us with our using fire as a management tool and make things kind of easier going down the road. So planning our plantings for some type of fire disturbance. The typical assumption is that the length of the flame, so if it's bent down by the wind, is about 3 times the height of the fuel. And so that can be a rule to look at when we're doing some of those plantings. And how high your vegetative growth is going to be, you can anticipate about 3 times that for safe planting for prescribed fires going down the road. Although you can mitigate for some of those things too, like by mowing before you're burning, so then your fuel height is certainly much lower before that happens. So there are ways to mitigate for that as well. Smaller sites equals smaller scale management, and that can either be good or provide some challenges for that as well, or opportunities for mitigation. The idea of leaving 70% as refugia, well, if you have a very small planting, that might not be something that works out for that area. So are there ways to create adjacent pollinator habitats? Maybe it'll be a larger pollinator habitat project over the long run, but then you can kind of mitigate for needing to have some kind of refugia. So when you are managing around those solar arrays themselves, you still have an adjacent habitat that you can use for refuge for the insects and wildlife. And as I mentioned earlier, tall vegetation could impact the energy output for those panels. Just checking the time here. And the next few slides, I will be going through a bit quickly just to make sure we have some time for questions. And so at this point, you might want to write some things down if we're getting through them. The monitoring that I had mentioned earlier is a very important aspect of managing these habitats. So you want to, before you're starting the project, before you get into the maintenance, know what you're monitoring for and picking a monitoring design that is suitable for the type of information that you want to get. And it might be species in, species out, being able to identify the things that were planted and how well they're coming in. It really is, it can be an opportunity to partnership with some experts, but this is also a great opportunity to help those who may not have a good working knowledge of ecology and identifying some of those plants to bring them in on that as well. And then having a better ecological knowledge helps us with understanding then what are the relationships between those species and what kind of stories and information are we getting out of the species present and then their relationships that they have within there. One of those might be some of our later flowering, later season flowering plants have not come up. And so what does that mean for the pollinators that rely on those late summer and early fall blooms? There are citizen science programs out there. We have the Michigan Butterfly Network with the Kalamazoo Nature Center. That is a butterfly monitoring program across the state with over 200 sites. And so these sites can be registered through any organization. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, they have guides to help with this. So there are also templates out there for this monitoring. And then, of course, documenting and sharing your results in some way, whether it be within the organization or with neighbors within the community, some point sharing that. So this is an example of the habitat evaluation form for the Xerces Society. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but I will be providing some links when this presentation is posted. There will be a page of resources so you can look into more depth. There are a lot of examples of these templates for monitoring. It's just about choosing the one that's going to work for you. Also keeping track of our management. Again, this is an adaptive approach. And so we want to look at the reasons going into the management decision and also look at what was the result of that management decision. So keeping good record of how those work will help with that, having a more successful planting. This is through Minnesota. They have a solar site pollinator habitat assessment form for established plantings. You can see this is after year 3, and this is a nice form too because it does give you some kind of score going through that. So being able to look at, well, what's acceptable and going through all these categories, they have, I think it's a total score of, it might be of, well, I can't remember now. It might be of 100, but looking what meets those pollinator standards. Now we have kind of a range and using this form to decide whether or not what we're doing is successful. Again, this is just another example of one of the templates that are out there to help with by having a resource that's already designed, and it is designed for usability amongst a large group of people. Some of those resources that I use pretty regularly, Bringing Nature Home, Douglas Tallamy book, the Using Native Plants to Restore Community by Nancy and Tom Small. These are books that may seem to have a different purpose, but when you're looking at what to expect for habitat maintenance and management, and even looking at how to anticipate some of those challenges, these are some of the books that already have those laid out in them. And there are many books like them. I choose these because they're written by local authors. And of course, the MSU Extension Native Plant Site, Michigan Natural Features Inventory, looking at some of those habitat communities. You can also look at rare species through that too. Michigan Natural Features Inventory is a great way to learn about the state of Michigan and its natural history. Michigan Prescribed Fire Councils, firecouncil.org. MichiganInvasives.org is the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition that works with all of the CISMAs, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Areas. The Midwest Invasive Species Information Network run through MSU. They've got looking at invasive species, but also they've got ways that you can learn how to identify them and learn some treatment recommendations as well, management recommendations through that site as well. There's also a tool to communicate within a community to be able to ask questions and such as a forum. And then mentioned that the Minnesota Habitat Friendly Solar Program is a good place to start, but again, not some of the only ones. There'll be some more resources on that one page download that'll be up when this presentation's ready for online consumption. But there's just a few for what was used today and going forward. So thank you all very much. I'll be around hanging out. Charles will field some questions.
Okay, Shelby has some questions that came to her, and I have some questions that came to me. So let's start with the ones that Shelby has.
All right. So our first question that we have for you, Ryan, is that this seems like great information on how to think about prairie restoration. However, they're confused on how this is supposed to work on a solar project. Prescribed burns aren't feasible under electrical equipment, and often vegetation under panels needs to be 6 to 18 inches. Would this type of planting and maintenance be compatible?
Can you repeat just that last portion of the question about the requirements under 18 inches?
Yeah, definitely. Often vegetation under panels need to be 6 to 18 inches. And would this type of planting and maintenance be compatible?
Great question. I'm going to go back to, if I can real quick, this slide right here. So this is the array that we have. So our habitat management or pollinator management happens in areas in the periphery around that solar panel. So the vegetation itself does not necessarily have to be growing, or it doesn't have to grow amongst and underneath those panels. So we do have a level of management to keep that short. And the fire that we do use is within adequate space around that to be able to use. So if fire is not an option, again, using some other tool that helps with creating some kind of disturbance, and that could be a periodic mow every 3 years or so. Also looking at doing a light disking in those areas to help create a light disturbance. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, and to go off of that, the other question that I had, there's actually two that ask quite the same thing, but this one also asks, has this been evaluated in terms of contracts, warranties, and liability concerns with the fire as well?
Yeah, so for liabilities go, that is, you want to have that under the prescribed fire manager. and whoever that might be. So if we are doing contractual fires, we always carry our own insurance with them. And we hold the group that we're working with as an additionally insured on that. And so that's typically where that coverage comes from.
Wonderful, great. That wraps up my questions. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, Ryan, this individual said, I am not familiar with a bee hotel as shown in picture with Boy Scout. Please describe what and where they were obtained and how they should be coordinated with pollinator plant species.
Sure. That bee hotel, thank you for asking that too. That was kind of a combination design between the Eagle Scout and us. They did a lot of the initial design work for that. And so what it consists of, I think there's some, where did I go? There it is. It has some old bamboo shoots. We've actually used dead vegetation such as the hollowed out stems of the Japanese knotweed. Some of the logs in there were ash tree that had come down from the emerald ash borer, and they've drilled out certain diameter holes for that. There are bee hotel guides for putting those together, but that was in part a intellectual design from that Eagle Scout. But basically, it's got some cover to keep out some of the moisture, and then for that bee hotels, if you look closely, you can see some of those smaller diameter things that are made up of bamboo or some kind of hollowed out stem. And we kind of put a diverse structure type of holes within there to help with that as well. And it can be, using the bee hotels themselves. They are a good way to, a very good way to have an aesthetic showing of pollinators and their homes, but also having like dead and down timber can help with some of those organisms as well.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. The next question is, are you familiar with the MSU scorecard for solar pollinator sites? I'm curious as to your experience in using that tool at your existing solar sites.
Well, it's not a tool that we've used, and I would certainly like to take a look at that. For our, we haven't used the scorecards in our solar array, and it's having staff that's pretty knowledgeable on site. We've been able to monitor those at a distance to be able to make some of those alterations. So for our site in specific, particularly, we haven't used that scorecard. But the more that I've looked into it, preparing for this presentation, I think that's something I want to do.
Yeah, that's something that we have. There's been a lot of time and effort put into it. The scorecard developed by our entomology department. It is similar to the one that you showed, but more suited for Michigan rather than Minnesota. And we're strongly encouraging folks that are putting in pollinator habitat in solar projects that they use the scorecard. So,
well, I'm embarrassed not to have it on there.
Yeah, I didn't communicate with you clearly on that, I guess. So, all right, but I did put the link in the Q&A box so the individuals can go out and there's an article and the scorecard, or there's an article with a link to the scorecard. Next question is, thanks Ryan and Charles, is there a glossary for the solar siting scorecard or a set of definitions and guidelines? Also, could grazing be something we see incorporated?
I'll take the grazing aspect of that. Certainly, there's a couple different groups in the area. I'm failing on remembering their names, but we have a person that uses sheep and another person that utilizes goats for that. And the way that they can come in and set up the grazing for that is they handle all of the mobile electric fencing and stuff to keep the grazers in their areas. But yeah, the grazers are certainly have been historically important part of those systems. for pollinators.
So I know the individual who submitted that question, and she happens to be with the American Solar Grazing Association, and that's a tremendous resource for anybody that's still listening here. Just do a web search on American Solar Grazing Association, and they have tremendous resources there. Michigan State University Extension is going to be tackling this issue in January. We'll have some webinars, webinar series that will, and we hope to do well, we intend to do a deep dive on grazing solar projects using sheep. And I also just discovered that goats, there are breeds of goats who don't climb, and they also are very good at vegetation control too. So
I've made a note, yeah, to bookmark that association too. So thank you for bringing that up.
That is probably the best resource that there is right at this point on grazing sheep in solar projects. So that's definitely something that you want to go check out. So the glossaries and the definitions and guidelines, I'm assuming that that's the case for solar siting scorecard. I know for ours, guidelines, yes, definitions and glossary, no. We've just written articles, and there's not a companion document that goes into, glossary and definitions. That's probably something we ought to tackle, though. That's a good suggestion. Another question here. Thank you. This was helpful. My question is around timing of the disturbances. What are the ideal times throughout the year for these approaches? And then parenthetically, this person says, what time of year would you recommend for a prescribed fire approach?
Great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So during the establishment phase, looking at mowing in April or May, then again in June, and then perhaps another in August. But you're really trying to catch those species before they go to seed. So that can be another indicator of when it's time to mow, not only the height, but when like something like spotted knapweed, if that's in the area, as just after the flower development, but before the seeds become viable. So the phenology of the plant can help decide that. But typically we set on the schedule May, June, and then August for that. As far as prescribed fire goes, again, when mitigating with plants and insects, ground nesting birds, that's something that historically would have happened pretty much any time the habitat would have been receptive to a burn. There's a lot of research now going on growing season burns, but typically for managing those systems, we do it in dormant systems for the most part. So burning in early spring or burning in late fall, those can have different impacts on the species competition or composition for the vegetation as well. I've heard it typically said that if you're burning in the spring, you're favoring more of the grasses, and if you're burning in the fall, late fall, you're going to be promoting more of the forb growth or wildflower growth for that.
All right, thank you. Two more questions here. Would you recommend keeping this planting to the fence line areas instead of near the panels? I believe PA 116 and the Michigan Scorecard require pollinator plantings under the panels. And that last statement is correct. When you look at the document that came out from the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, it says the owner agrees to plant a cover crop, including pollinator habitat, under the solar panels to reduce erosion and maintain soil fertility. So that person that submitted the question is correct on that.
Okay.
So his question
yeah.
is, would you recommend keeping this planting to the fence line areas instead of near the panels?
That is a very good question. And it's I think that's something that would have to be explored for each site. So working with the interested parties in on that, the having pollinator habitat underneath. Now, is that vegetative, or could that be, you know, when we're looking at some of the ground nesting bees and things that could use that as suitable, you know, suitable aspect of the habitat?
Yeah, so it would be planted. There would have to be plants growing underneath those the solar arrays.
Yeah, I'd have to say that's beyond my my knowledge base to answer that question.
So I would just say that each site is going to be different, and the management plan and the type of thing, the plants that are put in, that are planted there, are going to be different based on soil types, based on fertility. You know, certainly availability of seed is going to be you know, something to take in consideration. So, I mean, you want to maximize the value of the planting to make sure that it meets the qualifications or the requirements of the scorecard. But there's a lot of ways that you can do that. So I don't think there's one prescribed way. I think there's a lot of different prescribed ways, as long as they meet the scorecard. So the last question here is, this person says this is a bit off topic, but any suggestions on how to help pollinators when the state sprays insecticides to kill EEE, equine encephalitis?
Yeah, we dealt with that as an organization last year by, there was an opportunity to opt out of that spraying. And when you were able to opt out of that, as a group, they have to put a buffer around your area in order to lessen the chances that your area is going to be impacted, or your site specifically is going to be impacted by that spray. And so that was something, after careful thought. We've got many different educational programs and thinking about the human health impacts of EEE. But we came to the end that that we couldn't get enough assurances that the non-targets for that spray were going to be really mitigated for. So yeah, so there's as far as I know, you can opt out of some of those aerial applications. And through our county, we were provided with the links and information to be able to get in touch with that.
Yeah, I've got two responses to that, Ryan. One is from a colleague of mine who is an apiarist, and she says there isn't an opt-out option for EEE this year. And then another person typed in and said there's no opt-out option this year. So what was an option evidently is not an option this year.
Oh, it's very good to know.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You'll have the last.
Yeah, I was going to say that with that too, you know, our primary concern of some of those was if there was any dew or any level of moisture that was on the vegetation that could create an instance where you're lengthening the time for non-target impacts on that. So that's going to be something I'm going to certainly look into at what other options there might be. But yes, thank you all very much. Any more questions, please contact us at the Kalamazoo Nature Center. Our website's naturecenter.org. You can look for our conservation department there. Also, if more questions about fire, it's always a hot topic. Please visit firecouncil.org. And we're pretty responsive to a suite of questions and different levels of questions that come through there.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for your presentation. And that concludes this webinar here, and hope all of you have a wonderful day, and be sure and complete the survey when you exit out of the webinar here. And with that, we're done.